Hello, I'm a speaker on chapters 11 and 12 and what I learned from them. Chapter 11 was all about effective communication, communication being the transmission of thoughts, processes, and ideas throughout different channels. It specifically talked about the Shannon-Weaver communication model, which is that little diagram including the source, the encoder, potential noise that could be a disruptor, and then the decoder and the receiver, and how the receiver then gains feedback and goes back to the source and it all starts over again. It talked about how differing perspectives can be a problem when people think different things than the other person. It talked about those different channel types, including oral, written, electronic, and nonverbal. It gave the advantage and the disadvantages of those different types, and then it talked about weighing channel richness, high versus low, in order to find out which channel is best to use. It talked about barriers to communication, including filtering emotions, different perspectives like we talked about, and then poor listening. It talked about how you can combat poor listening with active listening, by using the three things of processing, sensing, and responding. And then talked about the three different types of communication, including downward communication, upward communication, and lateral communication. They talked about the two common communication networks, including formal, which kind of meant official, and then informal, which was more unofficial. It gave definitions and talked about grapevine, gossip chains, and cluster chains, and just to kind of look out for those. It talked about the importance of cross-cultural communication. It talked about high context culture, which was written and explicit spoken forms of communication, versus high context culture, which was nonverbal or like body language communication. It talked about the importance of social setting and social context and how to take that into forms of communication. It talked about other complicated factors, including slang, euphemisms, proverbs, etc., things like that, and then talked about overcoming those by doing your homework, making sure you check everything out, being an active listener, and never assuming, and then a few more of those. And then we get into chapter 12, which was trust, conflict, and negotiation. Trust being the dependence on the integrity, ability, honesty, and reliability of something. It talked about the three different types of trust being disposition-based, cognition-based, and effect-based. It talks about the outcomes being the trust triangle, which was that triangle of authenticity, logic, and then empathy. It touched on psychological contract and social networks and things of that sort. And then it talked about conflict. It went a lot into conflict. It talked about conflict in teams. It talked about conflict functional versus dysfunctional, and how in that you have task conflict, relationship conflict, and then process conflict. It talked about the 4 stages of conflict being the antecedents of conflict, the perceived/felt conflict, the manifesting conflict, and then the outcomes of conflict. And then it talked about the 5 conflict management strategies, which included avoidance, accommodation, competition, compromise, and collaboration. And then it talks about a negotiation and how you should always have a BATNA, which basically was just like a backup plan. And then it talked about how you can use 3 different things to dispute resolutions. You could use a mediator, an arbitrator, or a conciliator, and the differences between those 3. They talked about the differences in negotiation and bargaining, how bargaining was mainly related to price, and how you could have distributed bargaining, which was like a win and lose situation, or integrative bargaining, which is a win and win situation. And then it talked about the zone of possible agreement. So when you're in that negotiation bargaining stage where those 2 people come together and you have a potential to make a compromise.